It was the middle of July 2007, the kind of day that felt heavy with heat when the pavement shimmered and the still waters of the lake seemed like an invitation no one could resist. The brothers, 17-year-old Daniel and his younger sibling, 15-year-old Michael, had been restless all afternoon. The sun was dipping lower, but the air still clung to their skin, urging them to escape into the cool water. They told their parents they were heading down to the lake, just for a swim, just for a little while. It was the kind of promise no one thought twice about. After all, they had gone to that same lake countless times before, the shoreline only a short bike ride from home. A handful of neighbors spotted them walking together, towels slung over their shoulders, joking and shoving each other the way brothers often do. A girl from their school remembered hearing Michael laugh loudly, echoing across the water as they waded out. Another witness, a fisherman cleaning up his gear for the night, recalled seeing the older boy dive in head first, while the younger floated on his back, letting the fading light paint streaks across the surface around him. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Nothing suggested it would be the last time anyone would see them alive. As the minutes stretched, the shoreline grew quieter. Families packed up picnic baskets, younger children were called home, and the hum of the summer evening dulled. A few people noticed the brothers still out there, further than most dared to swim, their heads bobbing up and down. Then, without warning, the sight of them disappeared. No splashes, no cries for help, just a sudden absence, as if the lake had pulled them under without a trace. At first, no one panicked. People assumed they had simply gone under for a dive, or that they were playing some kind of game. But when the ripples faded and the surface stilled, questions turned to unease. The fisherman scanned the waterline, shading his eyes against the lowering sun, but he saw nothing. By the time the light had drained from the sky and the surface of the lake reflected only the moon, unease had grown into dread. When the boys failed to return home by dark, their parents felt the first sharp stab of alarm. They were punctual, especially Daniel, who had always been the more responsible of the two. Their mother called their cell phones again and again, each attempt rolling to voicemail. Their father grabbed his car keys and drove to the lake himself, headlights sweeping across the empty gravel lot. Their bikes were still chained near the trees, towels draped on the ground where they'd been dropped. The lake, dark and silent, stretched endlessly before him. He shouted their names into the night air, his voice bouncing off the stillness. No response. Only the low buzz of insects carried back. He waded into the shallows, shoes soaking through, but the water gave nothing back. That was the moment when fear shifted into something heavier, something irreversible. By the time the sheriff's department arrived, it was well past midnight. Flashlights probed the shoreline, beams slicing through the reeds and cattails. Deputies called out in firm voices, their words swallowed by the expanse of water. Boats were deployed, their engines churning softly against the still surface. The search began as neighbors watched from the bank, whispering prayers into the humid night. Word spread quickly through the small town. People drove out in their pajamas, headlights forming lines along the dirt road leading to the lake. Mothers clutched their children tighter, as if proximity to the tragedy could make it contagious. Fathers stood silent, staring across the water, imagining what it would feel like to have their own sons missing somewhere beneath the surface. Despite the urgency, nothing appeared. No floating clothes, no cries from the dark. The deputies swept powerful spotlights back and forth, the beams glinting off the ripples, yet finding nothing. Divers arrived in the early hours of the morning, descending into the inky depths with ropes and tanks. They surfaced, shaking their heads. The lake, thick with silt and weeds, offered no answers. Back on shore, the boys' parents stood together, gripping each other's arms with white-knuckled hands. The mother whispered their names over and over, as if repeating them could somehow anchor them back to the world. The father paced, demanding updates from deputies, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. People had seen them only hours earlier, laughing and splashing like any other summer day. Now, it was as if the water had erased them without leaving even a ripple of evidence. By sunrise, the search had already taken on the tone of something bigger than an accident. Reporters began to arrive, their cameras trained on the grief-stricken family, broadcasting images of the lake across the state. Rumors trickled through the crowd, whispers of whirlpools, sudden undertows, or something worse. Some murmured about hidden drop-offs in the lake bed, places that could swallow a person whole. Others wondered aloud whether the boys had staged their disappearance, though the idea seemed absurd in the face of their abandoned bikes and towels. What should have been a night of ordinary teenage adventure had twisted into the beginning of a nightmare. No bodies, no cries for help, no signs of struggle, just the weight of a question no one could answer. How could two healthy, strong brothers vanish within sight of others without leaving behind a single trace? As the day stretched into another night, with boats still dragging the lake and divers resurfacing empty-handed, the town felt the first real sting of something darker. This wasn't just a case of drowning. This was the start of a mystery that would haunt their community for years. And while the surface of the water looked calm again, below it, something remained hidden. Something that would not be revealed for 18 long years. The first official search began before dawn, when the lake was still wrapped in silence. Sheriff's deputies arrived with boats on trailers and lines of vehicles carrying emergency crews. By the time the first streaks of light appeared over the horizon, the area around the boat ramp was flooded with uniformed men and women preparing for what they assumed would be a straightforward recovery. Two teenage brothers missing in the water. It had to be drowning. That was what everyone told themselves, clinging to the idea that answers would come quickly. Spotlights were mounted on boats and cast wide beams across the water, turning the surface into a glowing patchwork of silver and black. The calls of deputies echoed into the air, each name carried across the lake, fading into the morning haze. Dozens of neighbors lined the banks, their faces pale with sleepless worry. Volunteers, some still in work clothes from the night before, stood shoulder to shoulder, scanning the water as if the boys might suddenly reappear. As daylight strengthened, the scene only grew larger. Search dogs were brought in, straining against their handlers as they sniffed along the shoreline. Helicopters swept overhead, blades chopping the air, their searchlights piercing into shallow coves. Divers slid beneath the surface, their bubbles rising in steady rhythms, disappearing into the silted depths where visibility dropped to inches. Hours stretched into a full morning, yet the water gave nothing back. Every recovery team knew the rhythm of drownings. Within a matter of hours, bodies usually surfaced. Sometimes they were tangled in weeds or carried into shallows by the current. But this lake betrayed none of those patterns. Deputies pulled in nets, finding only sticks and algae. Dogs barked and whined, but no consistent scent could be followed. Helicopters circled until fuel forced them back to the airfield. By noon, frustration and disbelief began to replace the early confidence of the crews. The parents stood by helplessly, their faces etched with a strain that only grew heavier as each hour passed. The boy's mother clutched a damp towel that had been recovered near the shoreline, holding it to her chest like it was the last trace of her son's. Their father demanded updates from deputies every few minutes, pacing the gravel until his shoes wore thin. He watched each diver surface, pulling off their masks, shaking their heads, and he understood more with each gesture. The lake was not giving them back. By afternoon, the sheriff's department called in reinforcements from surrounding counties. The shoreline filled with more uniforms, more boats, more equipment. Sonar sweeps were run across the deeper sections, computers sketching digital outlines of the lake floor. Every strange bump was checked, every unusual shadow investigated. But again and again, divers descended and found only mud. Still, the volunteers refused to leave. People from town brought food, coffee, and blankets, creating makeshift stations along the gravel lot. Mothers prayed aloud, their voices low and trembling. Teenagers who knew the brothers from school stood in clusters, whispering about the last time they saw them, replaying those final moments again and again in their minds. Nobody wanted to believe the water could erase two lives so quickly, so completely. As dusk approached, the spotlights were switched back on, their beams cutting across the rippling surface once more. The scene grew surreal. boats drifting silently in the darkness, dogs barking at shadows, men shouting into radios, the entire lake glowing under artificial light. It felt as though the entire community had been suspended in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. At midnight, deputies dragged long-weighted hooks along the bottom, pulling up mats of weeds and branches. Each time something heavy caught, hope surged among the crowd, only to collapse when the line broke the surface holding nothing but debris. The silence that followed each false alarm cut deeper into everyone watching. It was no longer only grief. It was confusion, disbelief, a gnawing sense that something wasn't right. By the second day, the scale of the search was staggering. More than 100 volunteers had joined. The Red Cross arrived with tents and water, television vans parked along the roadside, cameras turning toward the lake, reporters describing the mystifying disappearance of 2 local brothers. The case was no longer just a local tragedy. It was becoming a story that people across the state were watching. Yet the result remained the same. Nothing. No shoes, no shirts, no bodies. The cell phones the boys carried were never recovered. Not even a scrap of fabric floated to the surface. It was as if the lake had devoured them entirely, leaving not a single sign behind. By the third night, deputies admitted privately to one another that something about the case didn't add up. A drowning left traces, a runaway left clues. But this was silence. Their parents were told that recovery might take time, that bodies sometimes shifted with currents or became trapped. But the father wasn't convinced. He had grown up around lakes. He knew the patterns. And this wasn't one of them. The longer the search went on, the more the community's certainty unraveled. Was it possible the boys had never drowned at all? Had someone taken them before they ever entered the water? Or could they have slipped away deliberately, staging their disappearance under the cover of night? Each unanswered question deepened the sense of unreality. By the end of the week, the searchlights dimmed, the helicopters stopped circling, and the volunteers were asked to go home. Officials promised to continue, but everyone watching understood what had happened. The lake had yielded nothing. For the first time, law enforcement had no working theory they could defend. It was no longer framed as a drowning. It was framed as a disappearance. The family, drained and hollow-eyed, returned to a home that now felt cavernous in its silence. The towels were still there, the bikes chained under the trees, but the boys were gone. And with the absence of evidence, grief gave way to something even harder to bear: confusion. Because in the place of answers, there was only the haunting question: how could 2 brothers vanish into a lake that had nothing to give back? It was a question that would shadow them for the next 18 years, until divers finally revealed what had been waiting all along, hidden in the depths. In the days that followed the failed search, the town found itself adrift in something worse than tragedy: uncertainty. People could accept drowning, as cruel as it was, because it carried a kind of finality. But what unsettled everyone was the lack of proof. No bodies, no clothing, no physical trace of where Daniel and Michael had gone. That absence of evidence left a vacuum, and in that vacuum, theories began to bloom. Some clung to the simplest explanation: drowning. The lake was old and unpredictable, shaped by glaciers long ago. Rumors spread about hidden shelves where the ground dropped suddenly, pulling even strong swimmers into darkness. A retired fisherman told deputies about whirlpools he had seen there in spring, claiming they could drag a person down before he had time to shout. Neighbors repeated these warnings, imagining the boys swallowed by something unseen below the surface. Yet divers had combed those same waters for days and found nothing. How could 2 bodies vanish entirely? That unanswered question gnawed at the edges of the drowning theory. Others whispered of foul play. The brothers had been popular, but popularity carried shadows. Some wondered if a fight had broken out with other teenagers that evening, a prank gone wrong, or an accident someone had tried to hide. Deputies interviewed classmates, asking where everyone had been that night, pressing for inconsistencies in their stories. A few teenagers admitted to being at the lake earlier, drinking and listening to music, but all insisted they left before the brothers disappeared. Without evidence, no charges could be filed, but the whispers persisted. Parents in town eyed their children differently, wondering what secrets might be locked behind their silence. There were those who believed the brothers hadn't drowned at all, that they had run away. It was an idea that surfaced almost immediately, carried by the fact that Daniel had once talked about leaving town after graduation, eager for something bigger. Michael had been more reserved, but fiercely loyal to his older brother. The thought that the two might have staged their disappearance, slipping away under cover of the lake, took hold among some in the community. Perhaps they had left on purpose, gone to start new lives somewhere far away. The boy's mother dismissed the idea, insisting her sons would never vanish without a word, but detectives still examined their bedrooms, searching for notes, hidden bags, or signs of planning. They found nothing. Detectives worked down each possibility with clinical patience. They mapped the lake bed again, tracing sonar images line by line, searching for inconsistencies. They examined missing persons bulletins across neighboring states, looking for runaway brothers who fit the description. They combed through the boys' school records, emails, and phone logs, desperate for something that could tilt the investigation in a clear direction. Every trail ended the same way, with silence. As days bled into weeks, the family felt the weight of every rumor. Friends trying to comfort them often only repeated theories that cut deeper into their grief. At church, strangers whispered behind cupped hands, their voices rising and falling like a chorus of speculation. The boy's father, already consumed by frustration, began lashing out at anyone who suggested his sons had chosen to leave. He insisted something darker had happened, that someone knew more than they were saying. But no amount of anger forced the truth to surface. The investigation began to fracture under the pressure. Some deputies leaned toward drowning, citing their own experiences on other lakes, while others felt the lack of bodies suggested foul play. Without consensus, the case files thickened with notes that led nowhere. Each theory carried its own weight, each plausible in isolation, yet none strong enough to close the case. The boys remained missing, their names etched into reports, but their story frozen in uncertainty. At the edges of town, people began adding their own supernatural layers. Lakes had always carried folklore, and some claimed the water was cursed, that spirits held the boys below. For investigators, these stories were useless, but for the grieving community, they became part of the narrative, an attempt to make sense of the senseless. It added to the atmosphere of fear. Parents kept their children away from the water, the once beloved summer gathering place now marked with unease. Weeks turned into months, seasons shifted. The search parties dwindled, but the theories did not. They became the only thing people could hold on to. Some neighbors swore they saw the boys in distant towns, sightings that evaporated once police checked them out. Others pushed the idea that the brothers had been taken, victims of someone passing through. Truck drivers, transient workers, even the occasional stranger who had been seen near the lake. Each became a figure of suspicion in the absence of facts. For the family, the theories only deepened their torment. The mother clung to the possibility her sons were alive somewhere, grasping at runaway theories despite her earlier denials. The father doubled down on his belief in foul play, convinced someone was hiding the truth. Their household became a place where even hope was divided. Detectives finally admitted to the press what everyone already sensed. Without evidence, they had nothing. The sheriff gave a measured statement, promising the case was still open, but privately told his deputies they would have to move their attention to other pressing matters. For the parents, it felt like abandonment. For the town, it marked the moment when the disappearance of Daniel and Michael shifted from an active case into a lingering mystery. And yet, underneath the layers of rumor and theory, the truth remained where it had always been, hidden in silence, waiting nearly 2 decades for the right hands and the right equipment to finally uncover it. The weeks that followed stretched into months, and the family's home no longer felt like a place of comfort. What had once been filled with the sound of 2 teenage boys, slamming doors, music leaking from bedrooms, laughter spilling across the dinner table, had fallen into silence so thick it seemed to press against the walls. The kitchen chairs remained in place, but two of them sat unused. Their bedrooms, frozen exactly as they had left them, became shrines of sorts, with clothes still folded, school papers still scattered on desks, and half-finished plans cut short in an instant. Their father, unable to accept the lack of answers, began to unravel. The official investigation had slowed, deputies were moving on to other cases, and he refused to believe that silence meant the trail had gone cold. He poured every spare hour into his own desperate searches. He bought second-hand diving gear and waded into the lake himself, despite knowing he wasn't trained for the depths. He studied maps of the area, tracing old logging trails and long-forgotten roads, convinced that if the boys hadn't drowned, then something else had swallowed them up nearby. Every rumor, every whispered theory became fuel for his obsession. Friends tried to intervene, urging him to rest, but he couldn't stop. He drove to nearby towns following vague tips, chased unconfirmed sightings, and returned home with nothing but deeper lines on his face. Their mother clung to something different: hope. She couldn't bring herself to believe her sons were gone. In her mind, they were still alive somewhere, maybe trapped, maybe lost, maybe waiting for help. She left the porch light on every night, refusing to let it burn out, telling herself that if they returned, even after months, they would know they were welcome. She kept their favorite foods in the pantry, dusted their rooms regularly, and folded fresh laundry into drawers no one used. To outsiders, it looked like denial, but to her, it was survival, the only way to push through days that otherwise felt unbearable. Family friends noticed how the couple began to drift apart under the strain. Conversations turned into arguments, not out of anger, but out of desperation. He accused her of clinging to false hope, while she accused him of tearing himself apart with reckless searches. In reality, both were reaching for control in a world that had robbed them of it. Their marriage became like their house, standing but hollowed out. Birthdays passed in silence. On the oldest brother's 18th, there was no cake, only a single candle lit by his mother in the kitchen, tears streaking her face as she whispered his name. Christmas came and went with unopened boxes of decorations still in the basement. Relatives tried to gather, but every attempt at tradition ended in strained smiles and awkward silences. Holidays became markers of absence rather than celebration, each one reminding them of what had been taken. Neighbors described the home as shadowed. Children who once biked up and down the street avoided the house now, sensing the weight that hung over it. Friends who had once stopped by for barbecues or casual visits came less and less often, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say anymore. What words could possibly reach parents living in limbo? The family became isolated, existing in a quiet space that no one else dared enter. The father's obsession grew darker as time passed. He began keeping notebooks filled with maps, clippings, and names of anyone who might have information. He kept binders stacked in the garage, page after page of dead-end leads, annotated with his own speculations. Some nights he sat at the dining room table long past midnight, poring over documents while his wife slept in the next room. His search had become a private world, one that gave him a sense of purpose, but drove him further from everyone else. The mother, meanwhile, turned to prayer groups and community vigils. She stood with candles in her hands, surrounded by neighbors, whispering her sons' names into the night. She spoke softly about faith and miracles, about how people had returned years later in other cases, and clung to those stories as lifelines. Yet even in those moments, when the community tried to surround her with warmth, her eyes seemed distant, fixed on a horizon no one else could see. The tension between them grew unbearable. He believed the answers lay in relentless searching, in exhausting every possible lead, while she believed the answers would come if she simply held on long enough. Both paths left them drained, walking parallel lines that never met. Friends noticed how little they spoke to each other in public anymore, how rarely they touched. Their grief was the same, but their ways of surviving it were pulling them further apart. As years slipped by, the house itself became a kind of silent witness. The porch light still glowed every night. The boys' rooms remained untouched, their belongings preserved as if frozen in time. The father's binders continued to multiply in the garage, while the mother's prayers continued to fill the quiet spaces of the house. Each had carved out their own ritual, but together they remained fractured, unable to share the same ground. The disappearance had stopped being just a case. It was no longer about a mystery filed away in a sheriff's office. It had become a fracture that defined them, reshaping every part of their lives. Friends who once described the family as close-knit now struggled to find words. Neighbors who once admired their strength admitted privately that they feared the couple was breaking under the weight. Yet despite the silence, despite the growing distance, neither of them stopped. He continued to search, she continued to hope, and both lived in a world where answers never came. Each day ended the same way it began, with the gnawing absence of two boys whose fate remained hidden. And as the years stacked one upon another, the tragedy settled like a permanent shadow over the family, a shadow that would only deepen until the truth finally emerged from the water nearly 2 decades later. 18 months had passed since Daniel and Michael vanished, and the case had grown cold in every official sense. The sheriff's office, which once flooded the lake with boats and helicopters, had long since diverted its resources to more recent crimes. Files on the brothers remained open but untouched, stored in drawers that no one checked unless a reporter called asking for comment. For the family, however, time had not dulled the wound. It had only deepened the silence. The townspeople carried the mystery like a scar. Conversations in the diner still circled back to the night the boys disappeared. Teachers at the high school glanced at the empty desks that had once belonged to them, their absence never fully blending into the background. Parents kept a closer watch on their children, the carefree freedom of summer evenings replaced with warnings and curfews. The lake, once the heart of the community, grew quiet. Few dared to swim there anymore. The sound of laughter along its banks had faded, replaced by a superstition that the water had taken more than it should. But for the boy's father, silence was not an option. His grief had calcified into obsession. Where deputies saw a closed investigation, he saw a puzzle left unsolved. He began haunting libraries and county record offices, poring over maps, blueprints, and geological surveys of the land surrounding the lake. He stumbled onto rumors of old mining shafts, drainage tunnels, and forgotten culverts buried beneath the waterline. Convinced the brothers might have been pulled into one of these structures, he spent entire weekends hiking the perimeter of the lake, flashlight in hand, peering into thickets and storm drains. His searches grew stranger with each passing month. Neighbors recalled seeing him knock on doors, asking about rumors of parties that teenagers had once held in the woods. He scribbled down names, building a private dossier of kids who had been there that night. Some had long since moved away, but he tracked them across counties, showing up unannounced to question them. Each story he heard seemed to expand the mystery. One teen swore there had been shouting near the boat ramp that night. Another whispered that the brothers had been dared into something reckless, but no one could provide proof, and every lead collapsed the moment he chased it too far. At home, binders began stacking up in the garage, filled with his notes and maps. Friends described the space as resembling a detective's office more than a family home. He pinned newspaper clippings to corkboards, marked with red string that connected theories no one else could see. The sheriff grew frustrated with his persistence, warning him that pursuing false leads could damage the case, but the father no longer trusted official channels. He believed the truth was being ignored, or worse, hidden. The mother, still clinging to hope, watched her husband disappear into these obsessions with growing fear. She believed her boys might still be alive, held somewhere, waiting to be found, but his theories turned darker with time. He whispered about cover-ups, about how people in town knew more than they were saying. He accused former deputies of negligence, hinted that other families were involved. To outsiders, his voice carried the sharp edge of paranoia, but to him it was the only way to stay connected to his sons. Meanwhile, the town itself became a breeding ground for speculation. Campfire stories painted the brothers' disappearance as something larger than life. Children dared each other to ride their bikes past the lake at night. Teenagers invented tales about hidden cults in the woods or strange figures seen near the water's edge. Each new story fed into the father's desperation. He cataloged them all, chasing rumors of secret gatherings and searching for hidden clearings where no evidence ever appeared. By the second year, friends began pulling away. Invitations stopped coming, visits grew fewer. The family had become an island, isolated by the weight of their grief and the father's relentless pursuit of answers. The mother still lit the porch light every night, but the house no longer felt like a home. It had become a place of waiting, of endless research and unspoken pain. Detectives, when asked, admitted quietly that they had no working theory. Without bodies, there was nothing they could prove. Without evidence, there was nothing to pursue. For them, it was a case swallowed by time, but for the father, it was alive, gnawing at him with every passing day. He could not stop searching, because stopping meant accepting that his sons were gone forever, and he refused to surrender to that silence. Each dead end pushed him further into isolation. He began posting online, reaching out to forums dedicated to missing persons, sharing the details of his son's case with strangers. Some responded with sympathy, others with wild theories that only deepened his obsession. He followed them anyway, driving hundreds of miles to chase tips that always ended in disappointment. Each time he returned home empty-handed, the weight of failure settled heavier on his shoulders. And yet, despite the exhaustion, he kept going. Because every rumor, every whisper carried the fragile possibility of truth. It was that sliver of hope, or perhaps refusal to let go, that kept him moving long after the rest of the world had stopped. But obsession comes with its own cost. His marriage, once fragile, began to fracture completely under the strain. Friends described the home as filled with silence, punctuated only by arguments. His wife begged him to stop chasing shadows, to hold on to faith instead of suspicion. But he couldn't. He had gone too far down the path of theories and maps to ever step back. And so the case, already cold, sank deeper into obscurity. Officially, there were no new developments. Unofficially, the father's private investigations consumed him, while the town whispered stories that twisted further from the truth with each retelling. 18 months after the boys vanished, the search for answers had become less about the lake and more about the damage left behind. The mystery had grown heavier, not lighter. Every dead end only made it harder to breathe, and every false lead pulled the family further apart. And while no one knew it then, the real truth, the one that had eluded them all, was still sitting silently in the depths, waiting for the right moment to surface. 18 years had passed since Daniel and Michael vanished into the lake, and for most people, the story had become a ghost of memory. The town had changed, new families had moved in, and children who once whispered about the missing brothers had grown up and left. But the lake remained, dark and still, carrying its silence like a wound that never closed. For the parents, the passage of time had not softened anything. The father's obsession had faded only into exhaustion, while the mother's fragile hope had turned into quiet resignation. Their lives had been carved around an absence that had never been filled. It was in the summer of 2025 that a new chapter began. Across the country, volunteer dive teams had been making headlines, solving cold cases once thought impossible to crack. With advanced sonar, remote-operated vehicles, and divers who specialized in underwater recovery, they had begun pulling long-missing cars, evidence, and even people from lakes and rivers. When one such team learned of the brothers' disappearance, they reached out to the family. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the parents allowed themselves to consider that maybe the answers had been waiting in the depths all along. The team arrived with equipment far beyond what had been available in 2007. Where deputies back then had relied on crude sonar that painted rough, blurry shapes, these divers carried side-scan sonar capable of mapping the lake floor in sharp detail. They set up their base near the old boat ramp, where the brothers had last been seen, and prepared to sweep every corner of the water. For the family, watching strangers take control of the search felt both hopeful and terrifying. After years of disappointment, the possibility of answers was almost too much to hold. The first day of scanning revealed just how much had been overlooked. The lake's bottom was not flat or simple. It was cluttered with fallen trees, thick weeds, and decades of debris that created illusions on older sonar. But now, each ridge and shadow was revealed clearly. The divers marked points of interest, returning to them with underwater drones that carried cameras through the silt. Hours turned into long, tense days, the screen glowing with grainy images of submerged objects. On the third day, the team picked up an anomaly in a section that had been dismissed years ago. It was a deep channel near the far end of the lake, an area authorities once avoided because of poor visibility and thick mud. The sonar image showed a rectangular shape, too defined to be natural. At first glance, it could have been an old dock or a pile of debris, but the edges were too sharp, the outline too clean. It was something man-made. The divers prepared their descent with a focus that filled the air with tension. The parents sat quietly on folding chairs near the shoreline, their hands clenched, their faces etched with years of loss. Neighbors gathered nearby, the crowd growing as word spread that something had finally been found. The hum of the sonar equipment mixed with the nervous murmurs of people who had carried the story for almost 2 decades. When the divers dropped into the water, the surface rippled, then stilled again. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Radios crackled with clipped voices, updates in technical language that offered no comfort to the family waiting on shore. Then, one diver's voice came through, steadier but tinged with something unspoken. He described an object lodged deep in the silt, covered in mud and branches, but unmistakably metal. It was larger than expected, with a roofline barely visible through the years of sediment. The surface team froze as the realization set in. This wasn't debris. It was a vehicle. The divers circled it, brushing away layers of muck to reveal a rusted frame. The outline became clearer with every pass. 4 wheels, a cab, a bed. It was a pickup truck, submerged and hidden for 18 years. The divers confirmed what no one on land wanted to say aloud. The vehicle was intact, sealed, and had likely been there since the night the brothers disappeared. The news spread instantly across the shoreline. Some gasped, others covered their mouths, while the parents sat motionless, stunned by the weight of it. After so many years of searching, of rumors and speculation, the truth had been lying just beneath the surface, concealed by the lake itself. The team marked the location and surfaced, their faces grave. They explained that the truck was wedged in deep silt, angled downward, its cab buried. Extracting it would take heavy equipment and careful work. The process could not be rushed, not if they wanted to preserve evidence. The father stared at the water, shaking his head, whispering that he had always known the lake was hiding something. The mother, silent, held onto the armrests of her chair as if bracing for impact. By nightfall, news crews had arrived, broadcasting live reports about the breakthrough. For the town, it was a shock. For the family, it was the first tangible piece of truth in 18 years, yet answers still hovered just out of reach. The truck had been found, but the question remained: what was inside? The divers promised they would return with the proper tools the next morning to begin the recovery. The lake, which had stolen so much, was finally preparing to give something back. As the crowd dispersed, the parents remained by the shoreline, watching the still water, knowing that within its depths rested the truth they had been chasing for nearly 2 decades. And as the night stretched long and sleepless, one thought lingered above all. The lake had never been empty. It had been holding the brothers all along. The following morning, the shoreline was alive with anticipation. Trucks rolled in carrying cranes, winches, and barges designed for heavy recovery. Volunteers who had once searched with flashlights and hooks now stood back as professionals assembled equipment that looked like it belonged to another world. The sun was already warming the air, but the lake itself remained cold, still, and opaque, guarding what had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. The divers prepared carefully. Their voices were steady, but even through their professionalism, the gravity of what they were about to uncover was unmistakable. Cameras were strapped to their helmets, ropes secured, and lights attached to cut through the black water below. On the bank, the parents watched in silence. After 18 years of not knowing, every second felt unbearable. As the divers descended, The world above slowed. Radios crackled softly, relaying clipped updates as they neared the anomaly marked on sonar. Within minutes, their lights pierced the darkness, illuminating branches and silt suspended in the water. The truck came into view like a ghost rising from shadow, its frame cocooned by mud, its windshield buried beneath layers of sediment. The divers circled, documenting every angle. The truck's paint had long since eroded, rust consuming its once smooth surface, but the outline was clear. It was lodged nose down in the mud, as though it had slid into the depths and been swallowed whole. The bed was tilted upward, coated in algae, a silent marker of its long entrapment. When one diver brushed away a section of muck, the glint of glass reflected back, a window, fractured but still intact. They moved closer, checking the doors, the handles, the seams of the cab. The vehicle had been sealed tight by the pressure of the lake, making it both a tomb and a time capsule. Every attempt to peer inside was met with the murk of darkness, but then the beam of a light caught something behind the glass, a faint shape, pale against the shadows. The radio carried the diver's single word, spoken with quiet weight: remains. On shore, the crowd grew hushed. The parents didn't move, their eyes fixed on the surface as though they could see through the water themselves. The divers confirmed there were skeletal outlines within the cab, more than one, positioned as though trapped together in the final moments. The lake had held them all these years, preserved in silence. The recovery process was deliberate. Hooks were lowered, cables secured, and every movement calculated to prevent the truck from collapsing under its own rusted weight. The mud resisted, clinging to the vehicle as if unwilling to release it. Each pull brought clouds of silt swirling upward, obscuring visibility, until finally the frame broke free of its resting place with a deep groan of shifting metal. As the truck was winched toward the surface, tension along the shoreline became unbearable. Neighbors, reporters, and officials all fell silent, their eyes fixed on the dark water. For the family, it felt like watching the truth rise from a grave that had been hidden in plain sight. Slowly, the roof breached first, dripping with weeds. Then the full cab emerged, water streaming from shattered windows, revealing just enough to confirm what everyone feared. The remains were still inside. The truck was secured on a barge, the divers guiding it carefully as cranes swung into position. By the time it was lifted fully from the water, silence had spread across the crowd. The rusted frame, dripping and broken, was no longer just a vehicle. It was the missing piece of a story that had haunted them all for years. Inside, two sets of remains were visible, locked in place by the passage of time, their outlines unmistakable even through mud and debris. Law enforcement quickly cordoned off the area, pushing back the crowd. Forensic teams stepped forward with quiet efficiency, documenting everything before moving the truck under tarp. Every angle was photographed, every fragment preserved. What had begun as a disappearance had now shifted into something more complicated. The brothers had been found, but the discovery raised more questions than it answered. The parents stood apart, their hands trembling. After years of uncertainty, the truth had come back to them not as relief, but as a confirmation of their worst fears. The mother whispered their names, tears streaming down her face. The father's eyes locked on the truck, his body rigid, as though refusing to blink in case the truth vanished once more. For investigators, the focus shifted immediately to cause. Was this a tragic accident, a reckless joyride gone wrong? Or had something darker occurred that night, forcing the brothers into the vehicle before it slid into the lake? The scratches on the inside of the cab suggested desperation, attempts to escape, but the full story was still hidden within the rust and decay. The community, watching from the shoreline, felt the weight of the discovery sink in. Theories of runaways, kidnappings, and conspiracies unraveled in the face of this grim evidence. The brothers had been here all along, beneath the same waters where people had once fished, swum, and skipped stones. The lake had not released them, not until now. The truck was hauled away under heavy escort, destined for a forensic facility where experts would comb through its details. But the shoreline remained heavy with silence long after it disappeared down the road. People lingered, staring at the rippling water as if expecting more secrets to rise. And as night fell, the truth that had eluded them for 18 years now stood half revealed. The brothers had not vanished into thin air. They had been trapped together in the hidden depths of the lake. But the question remained, how had they ended up there? At the county forensic facility, the rusted pickup sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights, drained of the water that had concealed it for nearly 2 decades. Mud caked every corner, weeds clung to the undercarriage, and glass shards littered the floorboards. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than a wreck reclaimed from nature. But for investigators, it was a vessel of truth, a silent witness to the brothers' final moments. The first task was careful extraction. Forensic technicians worked in silence, brushing away mud from the cab, photographing every angle before moving the skeletal remains. 2 distinct sets were confirmed, one in the driver's seat, one in the passenger's. Though time had stripped away flesh, enough detail remained to suggest positions and postures. The driver's side showed deep scratches along the door panel, marks etched into the metal. On the passenger's side, the window was fractured from the inside, as though fists had pounded against it in desperation. The remains were removed slowly, cradled as though the years had not passed, and transported for analysis. Preliminary findings matched dental records. These were indeed Daniel and Michael. After 18 years, the brothers had finally come home, though not in the way anyone had prayed for. For investigators, the next step was determining how the truck entered the lake. Examination of the undercarriage revealed no signs of tampering with the brakes or steering, though rust had obscured much. The gearshift was locked in drive. The ignition showed the key still inside. To detectives, this suggested the vehicle had been running when it slid beneath the surface. But the question lingered. Who had been behind the wheel? Daniel, the older brother, had recently begun driving. Michael, at 15, was too young for a license. The positions of the ET. Remains indicated Daniel had been in the driver's seat. What puzzled investigators most were the scratches. They weren't consistent with a calm drowning. They told a story of struggle, of frantic attempts to escape as the water filled the cab. The cracked window on Michael's side suggested he had fought hardest to break free, pounding until the glass fractured but never gave way. The evidence painted a haunting picture. The boys had not gone quietly. They had fought until the end. The community absorbed the news with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. Many had clung to theories of runaway teenagers or mysterious abductions. Others had whispered about violence, conspiracies, even supernatural explanations. Now, with the truck pulled from the depths, those stories collapsed under the weight of grim fact. The brothers had not left willingly, nor been taken by strangers. They had been trapped inside a sinking vehicle, their final minutes marked by panic and silence no one heard. Detectives revisited statements from the original investigation, combing through notes from 2007. One detail resurfaced. Witnesses had reported seeing the brothers near the shoreline with older teens that evening, though those interviews had yielded nothing conclusive at the time. Now, that memory carried more weight. Had the older boys dared Daniel to drive down the boat ramp? Had it been a reckless act of showing off, one that spiraled out of control in seconds? Or had it been something darker? Pressure, coercion, a cruel prank that ended in death? The father seized on these questions, his suspicions reignited. For years, he had believed foul play was involved, and the discovery of the truck seemed to vindicate him. To him, the scratches proved the boys hadn't chosen this. They had been trapped, whether by accident or design. The mother, though, focused on something else: closure. She saw in the recovery not conspiracy, but confirmation. Her sons had been found. Their suffering was undeniable, their fate now certain. For her, the years of unanswered questions had ended, even if the answers hurt more than the silence ever did. Experts examined the truck further. They found no signs of outside force used to push it into the lake, no dents or damage consistent with another vehicle. The incline of the boat ramp suggested it could have entered under its own power. But one thing stood out. The windows had all been rolled up, sealing the cab. If it had been a joyride, Why hadn't at least one window been lowered? That small detail gnawed at detectives, suggesting a scenario in which the boys were caught off guard, trapped before they could react. As these questions mounted, the town revisited its own guilt. People who had been teenagers in 2007 now admitted they had heard rumors of dares and late-night gatherings near the lake. Stories surfaced of alcohol, of reckless behavior, of older kids who pressured younger ones. None of it could be proven now, years later, but the weight of those possibilities hung heavy. It suggested that the brothers' deaths might not have been fate alone, but the result of human choices that could never be undone. The scratched doors, the fractured window, the sealed cab, all told the same story. The boys had fought to live, but the water was stronger. Their final moments had been filled with terror, the kind no parent wants to imagine. And yet, those details were the only gift the investigation could now offer, the truth of what had happened, however unbearable it might be. When the findings were released publicly, the town gathered once again, this time not to speculate but to mourn with certainty. The father's voice trembled as he told reporters that his boys had not simply vanished, they had been silenced by a lake that held their truth for 18 years. The mother, clutching a framed photo, said she finally knew where her sons had been all this time, and that knowing, painful as it was, meant she could finally grieve fully. But the mystery was not entirely solved. The truck had been found, the remains identified, but the circumstances, the how and why, still carried shadows. For investigators, those shadows pointed back to the witnesses of that night, to the stories that had never been told fully. And though nearly 2 decades had passed, the truth was beginning to press at the surface, waiting to be spoken aloud. With the truck recovered and the brothers' remains identified, investigators turned to the only question left unanswered. How had it happened? The evidence from the vehicle gave fragments of a story, but to reconstruct the full truth, detectives needed to revisit the night of July 2007 and the people who had been there. Nearly 2 decades later, memories were faded and distorted, but guilt has a way of leaving marks, even in silence. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses who had spoken to deputies back then, focusing on the handful of teenagers who admitted to being near the lake on the evening of the disappearance. Many of them were now adults with families of their own, reluctant to revisit the past. Yet the discovery of the truck had broken something open. Old secrets, once buried under time, pressed at the surface with the force of inevitability. The most consistent thread across these interviews was that the brothers had not been alone that night. Several recalled seeing them near the boat ramp with a small group of older boys, high school seniors who had been drinking, their cars parked along the gravel lot. At the time, those teenagers had downplayed their involvement, insisting they left before anything unusual happened. But now, when faced with the reality of the truck and the bodies inside, their stories began to shift. One man, now in his 30s, admitted he remembered laughter mixed with shouts, the kind of rowdy energy that often came with alcohol and reckless dares. Another recalled the sound of an engine revving near the ramp, followed by splashes too large to be just kids jumping in the water. Fear had kept them silent then, but the years had eroded their defenses. Slowly, a clearer picture formed. Daniel had been urged, perhaps pressured, to drive the truck down the ramp as part of a drunken dare. Michael, loyal to his older brother, had climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. What happened next could be pieced together only through fragments. The truck had rolled forward, tires crunching on gravel, engine straining as it reached the waterline. Perhaps Daniel had intended to stop, to back away at the last second. But whether from nerves, inexperience, or the shouts of peers urging him on, the vehicle kept moving. The slope of the ramp, slick with algae, gave no traction once the front tires slipped under. Within seconds, the truck lurched forward into the lake. Panic must have erupted on the shoreline, but fear silenced confessions. The older teens, realizing what had happened, fled rather than calling for help. Some may have believed the brothers would escape through the windows. Others may have convinced themselves it was a cruel prank that hadn't gone too far. But the evidence inside the truck told the real story. The windows were sealed, the doors jammed by pressure, and the brothers trapped in a steel coffin as the water rose around them. Detectives cross-referenced these new admissions with the forensic evidence. The scratches inside the cab aligned with desperate attempts to claw open doors. The fractured passenger window matched the recollection of frantic pounding. The ignition still in place proved the truck had been running when it slid beneath the surface. Piece by piece, the puzzle fit together. The night had been fueled by recklessness, and silence had allowed the truth to remain buried for nearly 2 decades. For the parents, hearing these revelations was a second wave of grief. For years, they had been torn between theories: drowning, abduction, running away. Now they knew their sons had not been taken by strangers, nor had they vanished into thin air. They had been the victims of a reckless act, surrounded by peers too afraid to admit what they had seen. The betrayal was sharper than the loss itself. These were boys from their own town, familiar faces, who had watched the brothers disappear without raising the alarm. The mother, though shattered, clung to the fact that she finally understood the how. Her sons had not abandoned her. They had not left of their own choosing. They had been caught in the cruelty of a moment, in the reckless courage of teenagers who thought nothing could touch them. For the father, the anger was consuming. He had suspected foul play all along, but to learn that the answers had been within reach, hidden behind silence, drove him deeper into despair. The town itself reeled at the revelation. Parents who had once whispered theories about strangers or cursed waters now faced the reality that it had been their own children who bore witness. Some of those children had grown into adults with clean reputations, respected careers and families. To admit their silence now risked unraveling lives carefully built on forgetting. Yet the truth had a way of burning through the years. Investigators concluded that the case was a tragic accident compounded by fear and cover-up. No charges could be filed. Too much time had passed and too little evidence remained to prove intent. But for the family, the truth mattered more than justice. They finally knew what happened, even if the law could not assign blame. The reconstructed night was brutal in its simplicity. 2 brothers, urged into a dare by older peers, had driven into the lake, expecting to stop before danger. The water had claimed them faster than anyone expected, and those who had stood nearby, terrified of consequences, had chosen silence over confession. The recovery of the truck had unlocked not just physical evidence, but buried memories. For the parents, it was a cruel relief. Their son's story was no longer unfinished. For the town, it was a reminder that silence could stretch a tragedy across generations. And for everyone who had been there that night, it was a reckoning 18 years too late. The lake was no longer a mystery. It was a mirror, reflecting the choices of those who had been present and the cost of what they had failed to do. When the truth finally settled, it carried a weight almost heavier than the mystery itself. For 18 years, the family had lived inside questions that never ended, clinging to fragments, chasing rumors, arguing over hope and despair. Now, with the truck pulled from the lake and the boys identified inside, there were no questions left, only the brutal finality of what had happened and the unbearable silence of what could never be undone. The parents stood before their sons' graves, side by side but still worlds apart. The father, gaunt from years of sleepless searching, finally had the vindication he had clung to. His boys hadn't simply drowned. They had been victims of recklessness, abandoned by peers who had chosen silence. The mother, her hair now streaked with gray, held on to the closure she had prayed for. She had feared her sons were out there suffering, waiting. Now she knew their suffering had ended long ago, beneath the cold water of the lake. For the town, the discovery forced a reckoning. People who had once repeated wild theories now faced the truth that it had been their own community that failed the brothers. Older men and women admitted they had heard rumors of what happened that night but never pressed for details. Teenagers who had been there carried guilt into adulthood, raising families of their own while burying what they had seen. The silence that lasted 18 years had not been the lake's doing. It had been human. The authorities ruled it an accident, with no criminal charges possible so long after. The fact, the truck's condition, the lack of forensic proof beyond the brothers' desperate attempts to escape, left no room for prosecution. Yet the father could not let go of the thought that silence had been as lethal as the water. If someone had spoken out, if someone had called for help, the ending might have been different. That torment would follow him for the rest of his life. The lake itself changed after the truth came out. What had once been avoided out of superstition became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People left flowers on the bank, built small wooden crosses near the ramp where the truck had slipped under, and spoke of the brothers in hushed tones. The community, once fractured by rumor and speculation, found itself bound by guilt and remembrance. Parents told their children the story not as folklore, but as warning. Silence can be deadly, and one reckless moment can echo for decades. For the mother, the answers brought a fragile kind of peace. She no longer left the porch light burning. The bedrooms, preserved for 18 years, were finally closed. At the funeral, she spoke not of the boys' deaths, but of their laughter, their bond, the life they had shared before that night. For her, grief had always been tethered to uncertainty. Now, for the first time, it could take its full shape. The father, though, remained haunted. He walked the shoreline in the evenings, staring at the place where the truck had been pulled from the depths. He told anyone who asked that justice had never been served, that the people who fled that night had lived free while his sons lay in silence. The truth had been revealed, but for him, it was too little. Too late. 18 years of mystery had ended, not with a stranger, not with an abduction, but with a simple, devastating truth. Two brothers lost to the water, victims of a dare and the silence of those who should have saved them. The revelation closed the case, but left behind a scar that no family, no town could ever fully heal. And so, the story of Daniel and Michael became more than a mystery solved. It became a reminder etched into the memory of everyone who heard it, that sometimes the deepest wounds are not carved by water or time, but by the things left unsaid.